everyone. So this is part 4 of our series in Lent, and I'm looking at From Fear to Courage. And it's based upon the story of David and Goliath from 1 Samuel 17, but because I don't have the time to read the whole thing, we're going to look at the back end of it, verses 32 to 50, which reads, David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it." A bit violent. "Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around, because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. And then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. So he could have had all of this armor, all of these weapons, but he chose to go with his staff and rocks. Well, not the best idea. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head." Violent again. "This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. So I've got 4 key points from here, from 4 verses. They're not in order, so my bad. But the first one is that faith is key, based on verse 47, which, to remind ourselves, it says, "All those gathered here will know it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he'll give all of you into our hands." The battle isn't ours. It's never meant to be ours. It's supposed to be up to God. We should be leaving it to God in every situation, because we were never supposed to be the ones that end up fighting. We were supposed to be the ones living in bliss, living under God's umbrella, but we ended up outside of that, so we now need to prepare for these battles. And the battle is won when it's in God's hands, and guess what? It's always been in God's hands. Sometimes I feel like we can be too focused on our speck of creation to be focused on who created it. We are too focused on our own lives, and this is going on, I've got this issue, I've got this thing coming up, when we can realize that God's given us these opportunities to show him through them. Because what David did is he left the battle to God. When he did that, he already had belief in the outcome, and he had belief that he knew where it was going, and he knew he would win. That's why he could do it with only a sling, a stone, and a staff, and no armor. So I feel like, as a church, going into any situation, whether it be an exam or a job interview, we need to have that belief that the enemy has been conquered and that our eternal success has been assured. Because as it reads in Luke 12:25, "Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life?" We can't be worrying in these situations, because God has it handled for us. God has it in his hands, ready for the success to be delivered. And that a practice for this I would recommend is just release. Like thinking of your worries, writing them down, whether it's praying, and we'll have time to respond later. But I think it can really help us to remind us of Jesus and remind us of what his sacrifice did for us and the power that it gives us. The next point that I'd like to make is that God uses the unexpected, uses all of us. 1 Samuel 17, verse 33 reads, Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." Even with the odds stacked against him, God used David to teach everybody the lesson of courage. He used David back in Old Testament times to right up until now in this church in the middle of England to teach us that God gives us courage. He can deliver us from that fear to our courage. And that personal story that I'd like to share that goes along with this is that right the way through school, through different experiences, I became anxious. I absolutely despised speaking in public, speaking on stages like this. But Jesus looked at that weakness and said that that's what he's going to use me for. Jesus used me up to this point to become a preacher, to deliver this message from that anxiety and that anxious position I had. Now, we need to realize that that God will use us, whether it's small actions or big actions, whether it's donating in church or if it's just going up to someone and checking how they are. God will use all of us. And if God can encourage David to use the courage that God gave him to go and fight that Philistine, if he can go and fight Goliath, then he can encourage us as well. Which leads to my next point, that God is always the same. Verse 37 reads, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." David recalled upon his past victories with God to use them as strength for his present battles. He looked at what had happened over his life, the things that God had brought him through, saving him from lions and bears and all these tough experiences. And he said, if he can do it once, he can do it again. And that if God's delivered you once, he'll deliver you again, no matter what struggle it is, whether it's mental health problems, whether it's loss, grief, anything that happens, God can deliver you through it because he's done it before. We need to, and going on with this, we need to expect God to deliver us. If we know he can do it, and if we come boldly to the throne of God, like it reads in, can't remember what book it is, sorry. Whatever God puts us through, he's going to deliver us from. Because in Mark chapter 9, it's a story about this young boy who's possessed by a demon, and Jesus comes to hit the boy and his dad, and the dad asks him, "Deliver this demon from my son, if you can." To which Jesus replies in verse 23, "If you can," said Jesus, "everything is possible for one who believes." We need to, just as David did, reassure ourselves with our past experiences that God won't fail, whether it's God helping you through bereavement or God helping you through struggles in school or workplaces. God will do it when you believe. And a practice for this one is journaling. And I think that writing down what God's done for you, writing down all of your experiences, like maybe people you've lost or people who've came in and out of your life, experiences in school or work, maybe it's promotions or losing jobs, anything like that. God, write down what God's done so that you can remind yourself of the beauty of his sacrifice and the beauty of the courage that he brings to you. And the last point that I'd like to bring from this is the power of courage. Verse 45 reads, "David said to the Philistine, 'You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied.'" No weapon formed against us shall prosper, church. Nothing that comes against us, no amount of struggle, no amount of load that we have to bear, no amount of anything can stop us when God's by our side. And that we need to take that into our daily lives. We need to go into our daily lives with our heads held high, knowing that the courage that God brings us is enough every single day. There's nothing that the world ever throws at you can stand up against our God and win. Nothing has ever in history gone against God and won. Nothing. And like I've said before, God is always the same. God will continue to deliver in any situation at any time, because even giants are defeated when God is by our side. So we need to not be afraid of struggles that might seem bigger, because they aren't. We need to not be taking our problems to God. We need to be taking God to our problems. We need to be going to our problems with the armor of God, knowing that he's going to empower us to get through them. And that last practice that we can try later is prayer. And that just consistent prayer, being personal with God, just being quiet in, like, whether it's in your bedroom, whether it's in closet, I'm not going to judge, wherever it is, you can just get down and just pray to God. Just pray about any struggles, thank him for what he's brought you through. Just make sure that you're praying through all situations. And so, just to bring it all to a close, the 4 points that I want you to take away from this is that faith is key. Believe that God will deliver, and he will deliver. That God uses the unexpected. Don't count yourself out. Don't think that because you did this and this, that God won't use you, or because you're this person, that God won't use you, because God will use you. God is always the same. Expect God to move. And we expect God to move. That's when the real change can come. And the power of courage, we need to arm ourselves with the strength of God.